And continuing with our Brexit update here on the 62nd weekly Friday show from Radio Free UK, we have an item from Real Clear Radio. It's always good to hear these kind of reports from other countries. They tend not to have the huge bias that we see from the BBC.
Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week, we speak with three guests who cover the interplay between regulatory sclerosis and the Brexit rebellion. Wrapping up our program will be Richard Williams, Director for the Regulatory Studies Program at the Mercatus Center and former Director for Social Sciences at the FDA. Along the way, we'll chat with Iain Murray, CEI's Vice President for Strategy and our go-to British expat. Up first, I'm pleased to welcome Julian Morris, Vice President of Research at the Reason Foundation. Julian, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Bill. Good to be here.
Julian, I asked you on to help us think about the path ahead for the post-Brexit UK and maybe share your views on whether the European Union will continue its integration march without them or begin flying apart. How can England make the most of this?
So there are three key elements to Britain's negotiated exit from the EU. One is the way that Britain trades with the EU and with the outside world. The second is Britain's approach to immigration. And the third is Britain's approach to regulation of products and of the environment and other elements. At the moment, the EU sets Britain's trading relationship with the rest of the world. Outside of the EU, Britain will be free to establish whatever trading relationship it wants.
What are the prospects for rapid negotiation and adoption of bilateral free trade agreements between the UK and non-EU countries?
Before the Brexit vote, the United States said that it would put Britain to the back of the queue with regard to a bilateral trade agreement. Almost immediately after the UK had decided to leave, the US rapidly put Britain to the top of its trade negotiations. Unsurprisingly.
What would happen if the UK just announced unilateral free trade with the world and whatever happens, happens?
Britain should remove trade restrictions currently in place with other countries, especially all tariffs. Why? Because when people in Britain, that's companies or individuals, are able to access goods from other parts of the world without tariffs, they benefit. They benefit as consumers and they benefit as producers. Mm-hmm. They become lower cost producers of goods. You know, when trade is discussed, in most cases, the focus is nearly always on exports. There's almost never a discussion of the importance of reducing the cost of imports. And in fact, if you look at the way that trade negotiations typically take place, they are framed in that context. Mm-hmm. It's, we will give up our tariffs in return for you giving up your tariffs. Well, the reality is that low tariffs or zero tariffs, ideally, are beneficial to the importing nation. The idea that we should have tariffs in order to restrict imports and thereby supposedly protect domestic industry is a delusional idea that was promoted by vested interests, in the 16th and 17th century, and we still haven't got rid of it.
So UK can start out by unmaking a whole bunch of laws that impose tariffs. What about unmaking all the regulations that the EU piled on top of them? What's the prospects for that?
That's a trickier question. I mean, ideally, Britain would have a set of regulations that were really appropriate to address genuine problems. Unfortunately, both domestically in Britain and in the EU, that's not the case. There are all sorts of regulations which go well beyond what is desirable and in many cases are even counterproductive. The question is whether Britain is going to have the balls to cut back on those regulations, starting with the regulations introduced as part of Britain's membership of the EU.
For those just joining us, we're speaking to Julian Morris, Vice President of Research at the Reason Foundation. So, Julian, fear of Muslim refugees loomed large in the Brexit debate. Where does immigration reform fit in the picture, and what type of immigration policy is England likely to adopt?
As part of the EU, Britain agreed to open migration. That contributed to a huge boost in Britain's economy. The movement of people to the UK expanded our labour supply, enabled us to be a more effective producer of goods and services.
Plus, you stole all the French entrepreneurs.
Obviously, it also gave opportunities to people in other countries whose economies were less robust for various reasons, whether it's France because of the overtaxed, overregulated French state, or Poland, which was simply at a lower standard of economic activity. People benefited, but there's a bilateral benefit. However, fears of outsiders have grown, sadly, and blaming foreigners is probably somewhat mistaken, but concern was raised by some of those who pushed for the Brexit vote. And so it's likely that Britain will seek an agreement with the EU that enables it to limit migration from the EU. The best possible outcome would be that Britain adopt an immigration policy that is more open to the outside world while being slightly less open to Europe, but is impartial with regard to the origin of the migrants and focuses more on the ability of those migrants to improve Britain's prospects. One idea was that migrants to Britain should pay a fee. That would be a sorting mechanism. Mm-hmm. Another possibility is to follow Sweden, which has a migration policy that enables people to live and work in Sweden as long as they have a job. And it's not nearly as restrictive as the similar sounding policies that currently exist in the UK and in the US. In the US, you have the H-1 visa, which enables people to migrate for employment. But that actually is a very long-winded process and very bureaucratic and expensive. In Sweden, basically, you just have to prove that you've got a job and that's it. You can come in.
What do you make of the cabinet Britain's new Prime Minister Theresa May has put together, particularly making Boris Johnson Foreign Secretary? Many had written him off after he pulled out of the running for PM.
Initially, I was quite surprised to see Boris there. I wonder if there was a bit of a backroom deal between Boris and Theresa May. It's just a hypothesis. Another possibility, of course, is that Boris is going to be respected by the people who supported the Brexit vote. So it's worth beginning by saying that Theresa May was against leaving the EU. Mm-hmm. So we now have a Prime Minister in the UK who is overseeing, in a broad sense, Britain's exit from the EU, while that was not her original intention.
Does appointing Boris give her a bit of a good cop, bad cop methodology to do her Brexit negotiation?
She's appointed both Boris Johnson and, of course, the Brexit negotiation will actually be undertaken by David Davis, who is also in favour of leaving the EU. So two people in the cabinet who are strongly in favour of leaving the EU and who are really the key people in charge of exiting. Will Theresa May play the good cop against the bad cop of Boris and David Davis? I don't know. I think it would be better if there was a unified position. It seems that the best position would be to come up with a clear line on what is most going to benefit Britain and sticking to that. There are all sorts of threats made by EU politicians before and after Brexit. I think that's going to be softened dramatically. The dynamics of this are interesting because German car manufacturers and other producers and French pharmaceutical companies export significant amounts of goods to the UK. They don't want Britain to impose tariffs on those goods. Britain doesn't really want to impose tariffs on those goods either. There's going to be a deal that is acceptable to both parties and probably beneficial to the United Kingdom.
We're speaking with Julian Morris, Vice President of Research at the Reason Foundation, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. To hear more programs like this, please stop by RadioFreeUK.org or follow our podcasts on YouTube. And to keep up with the latest news and commentary in this hot election year, check out America's premier independent political website, RealClearPolitics.com. Ahead, we'll wrap up with Julian and then welcome Iain Murray, Vice President for Strategy at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Stay tuned.
The Competitive Enterprise Institute is a nonprofit public interest group based in Washington, D.C., promoting innovation and entrepreneurship for a prosperous and peaceful society. Visit CEI.org to learn more.
Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We're speaking with Julian Morris, Vice President of Research at the Reason Foundation, about the repercussions of Brexit. Julian, let's turn our attention to the European Union minus Great Britain. We're hearing calls from other member countries that they'd like to hold leave votes of their own. Are these votes likely to be allowed?
The EU doesn't have a say in whether a country has a leave vote. The question is whether the governments in various EU countries allow leave votes. The potential for a set of countries to leave is substantial, and I think now the onus is on the EU to shape up, to identify the problems that have led to Britain's exit and the threat of other countries also looking to exit. And the way to do that is to address some of the underlying problems. Early on, the EU provided something of a model to the rest of the world as to how to structure regulations to enable free trade between states. It had a principle of mutual recognition, and that would be a great principle for all nations to be trading among one another.
Julian, anti-immigrant, anti-EU parties are becoming increasingly strong across Europe. Do you see any of these parties reaching majority status in the near future?
Well, I mean, I think you could argue that you already have that in Hungary, and you're close to it in Austria. Underlying the anti-immigrant feeling is the overbearing nature of the European Union. If the EU's bureaucracy had less power, then it would be much more difficult for these anti-immigration parties to make the case that the EU is the problem and that immigration is the problem.
Let's move on to the glue that's binding many of these countries together. The European Central Bank seems to have gotten itself in a corner, unleashing massive and unconventional stimulus methods. How long can ECB President Mario Draghi continue doing whatever it takes to keep the euro from imploding?
If the euro is to continue as a currency, it has to return to stability. That means returning, in a sense, to normality. Negative interest rates can't go on forever, and something that can't go on forever will end. These have been driven by the markets driving yields down because they're fleeing riskier securities. If you want to get markets back into riskier securities, the solution isn't to keep on driving down interest rates at the central bank. The solution is to remove barriers to entrepreneurship and economic growth, which is the real reason why people are leaving those riskier securities.
Speaking of economic growth, it's essentially ground to a halt in Europe under the burden of not just the monetary policies, but the fiscal policies and regulatory policies of the ruling elites. How can European countries ever repay their sovereign debts without strong economic growth?
I don't think it's possible. So the only solution here is to have some combination of significant paring back of the regulatory state. Especially many countries in Europe, France, for example, has really ridiculous restrictions on employment. And the EU as a whole, with the exception of a few countries, have requirements that employers give employees 28 days of leave every year. And there's restrictions on the extent of the working week. I mean, these kinds of rules make European economies less competitive. So production leaves the EU and goes elsewhere.
But look what happened when Hollande tried to make even the smallest reforms. There were riots in the streets in France.
France has a history of organizing against reform, with truck drivers blockading ports and the like. The French state has to be more cohesive and robust in its response to these aggressive tactics. This is not a majority of the French people. Reform of the French economy would benefit the French people. Allowing a minority of people to disrupt the process of reform is just not acceptable. But unfortunately, very often, the police really turn a blind eye. I don't mean people marching. That's one thing. But, the kinds of activities that are common.
Setting fire to Ubers.
Right, exactly. That means it's just not acceptable. That's not driven by the people. The people of France were using Uber, which is why the taxi drivers objected. In Britain, the taxi drivers in London objected to Uber, but they held some protest, but they didn't burn Uber cars. And if that sort of thing happens, there have to be consequences. So I think there probably has to be some reform within the police system in France, and certainly a stronger commitment to applying the rule of law. But it's not just France. I mean, Greece did it in spades. I mean, the riots in Greece were terrible. But of course there, the problem was more that the public sector workers feared that any reforms would affect them.
Do you ever see the EU returning to its roots as a simple free trade zone, giving up its march toward political integration?
I think it's possible for the EU to become a more free trade-oriented entity. One way towards that would be for more countries to leave the European Union itself and join the European Free Trade Area. That's the group of countries, Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway, and Switzerland, that have free trade as the basis, but they don't have to comply with all of the regulations, and they don't have their trade with the outside world determined by the EU. If Britain joins EFTA, that will be a start. Who knows which the next country would be? Maybe Denmark. If a number of countries leave the EU and join EFTA, I think that could drive the EU towards reform. But it seems plausible that what would happen there would be an enlarged EFTA and a contracted European Union, and the contracted European Union would engage in some reforms which kept the members inside it. But I think creating that dynamic is important. So I think it would be good if the UK were to join EFTA, because it would create a stronger contrasting group that could then compete with the EU for membership.
Well, Julian, we appreciate you sharing the British view with us. Thanks for coming on the show.
It's a pleasure.
That was Julian Morris, Vice President of Research at the Reason Foundation. Next up, we'd like to welcome Iain Murray, Vice President for Strategy at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Iain, welcome back to the show.
It's great to be back with you, Bill.
Iain, last time we had you on, maybe a year ago, we discussed the history of the National Labor Relations Board and the evolving relationship between employees, employers, and the government. I'd like to continue in that vein today and cover two subjects. First, let's discuss some of your more recent work on the evolution of corporations as they move ever further into the so-called gig economy. And second, as a British expat, I'd like to get your views on labor regulations in the UK before and after Brexit. Let's start with The Nature of the Firm, which is the title of an influential paper written by economist Ronald Coase 80 years ago. What was so important about his original observations?
Coase is a very interesting character. He did all his work at the Chicago Law School because he's not a quantitative economist. He's a guy who went out and looked at what people actually did, how they actually behaved in the economy. One of the questions he wanted to ask was, why do we have firms? It's not a question that you can really answer with calculus. He looked at it and thought, okay, if you want something done, your natural reaction is to go to a market and find somebody to do it for you, pay them, and then that's the end of it. But if you're an entrepreneur trying to get the same thing done day after day after day, the market doesn't quite solve that problem. And there are all sorts of costs, which he initially called marketing costs, but eventually he chose a different term, transaction costs, that just make this process really difficult for an entrepreneur. So what the entrepreneur does instead is hire somebody to do the job for him under an employment contract rather than a commercial contract. But of course, once you employ somebody, then there are all sorts of costs that are involved with that, and those are the costs of organizing an organization. And I think what's happening today is that we're seeing Coase's fundamental observation about transaction costs is really becoming the dominant issue in the economy.
Coase was writing at a time when the Second Industrial Revolution had given way to the Great Depression. And during that time, and up until the dawn of the information age, scale and access to capital and stability were the primary determinants of industrial success. How has that changed in our modern information age?
Well, as there's more information out there, it's become more important to get that information. So firms have reacted by instituting new business practices, like contracting out non-essential services. Why do you really need to employ a cleaner for 8 hours a day when they're only coming in right at the end of the day?
Right.
So let's contract out that service. Franchising was another way of building innovation into the system, saying to people who would otherwise be managers of individual stores or restaurants, saying, you're going to be the owner of this restaurant. It's all on you. You can innovate to your heart's content as long as you use certain basic branding practices. That's how McDonald's got the Big Mac. That was invented in a franchise. It wasn't invented by corporate McDonald's.
Well, this extends to the consumer side, too. Look at the difference in information flow between hailing a 1930s-style cab and then telling the driver where you want to go, and Uber.
That's exactly it. I mean, you've now got to the stage where you actually know where the cars are. And that's just such an amazing advantage and step forward.
And they know where you want to go, and you have surge pricing, so you know when there are shortages and there are surpluses, which makes sure you can always get one in the rain. It's a completely different world.
It is. The amount of information that our systems can now convey to us about our transactions is quite astonishing. And that's why transaction costs are the dominant feature of this new economy. There's so much more information in a transaction than in an organization that I think we're seeing a move further away from the large corporation, or at least that's the way the economics is pushing us, than back towards it, which is where the regulation is pushing us.
Which, of course, takes powers away from unions and the government if we go into smaller and smaller firms.
That's exactly it. Rational innovation, which is what is happening as a result of these economic and information changes, that's not what they want. They want to attach certain conditions to things, like contraceptive coverage for all, that convey information about an ideal society, a utopian society. And so regulation of the large corporation that has little competition is the easiest way to deliver those conditions. But innovation is really the enemy of that system.
We're speaking with Iain Murray, Vice President for Strategy at CEI, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. To make sure you don't miss any of our shows, stop by RadioFreeUK.org and sign up for updates. Today's program was partially underwritten by the generous support of Donors Trust, the donor-advised fund committed to promoting a free society. For more information, visit DonorsTrust.org. Ahead, we'll wrap up with Iain, then move on to our conversation with the Mercatus Center's John Williams, former Director for Social Sciences at the FDA. Stay tuned.
The Competitive Enterprise Institute is a nonprofit public interest group based in Washington, D.C., promoting innovation and entrepreneurship for a prosperous and peaceful society. Visit CEI.org to learn more.
Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We're speaking with Iain Murray, Vice President for Strategy at CEI. Iain, I'd like to use the remainder of our time to get a post-Brexit analysis from you today. Is leaving the EU a disaster or an opportunity for England?
Well, it could be both. It really is a huge opportunity to press a reset button. But if they get things wrong, then it could be a real disaster. It's a difference between an open Britain that's open for business and one that shuts up shop. If it shuts up shop, then that could be a real disaster.
There was a lot of hawkish rhetoric spilled prior to the Brexit referendum by bureaucrats and even Obama trying to scare voters into remaining in the EU. Now that the deal is done, do you expect rational transition negotiations, or will EU bureaucrats be more focused on making an example out of England to keep the other member countries in line?
I'm glad you mentioned Obama. Obama's visit to the UK when he said that Britain would have to go to the back of the queue for trade deals. According to the pollsters, that produced a 3-point swing. So Obama's visit might actually have tipped the referendum in favor of leave. What we're seeing here, I think, is a classic prisoner's dilemma. The EU has very good reasons to be vindictive towards Britain. They don't want any more countries to leave.
But then again, the Germans sell a lot of cars in the UK.
They do indeed. In fact, a fifth of German car exports go to the UK. So there's a lot of reason why they should be rational as well. And if both sides are rational, I think that we could come to a very beneficial deal on both sides.
Trade relations aside, what's the most important thing England can do within its own borders to remove or reform the tens of thousands of regulations heaped on them by the EU?
This is where an idea by our Competitive Enterprise Institute colleague Wayne Cruz could really be very helpful, which is to establish a commission on regulatory reduction and just get the government to send them all the tens of thousands of regulations that the EU has asked them to impose, and the Commission send a recommendation to Parliament that these regulations be repealed, these regulations be reformed, and these regulations should stay.
And it'd be like an up or down vote the way they did with the base closing commissions here in the U.S.?
Yes, when legislation is needed. One of the things about the British regulatory system is that you don't always need legislation. It could be that the Commission could just send a list of recommendations to the House of Commons, and the House of Commons, if it doesn't act, those regulations would be repealed automatically.
London is one of the foremost financial centers of the world, and members of the finance industry apparently overwhelmingly wanted to remain in the EU. Does London risk losing its primacy?
When you look at the way that European financial regulation works, I don't think it should be as big a concern as it perhaps was. A lot of financial regulation is actually set at the global level. So, for instance, things like the Basel Accords are basically dealt with at a level beyond the EU. In the end, the British financial regulatory system won't look that much different from the EU's. And the EU has a principle called passporting, which allows other countries access to its financial markets if they have a regulatory equivalence. And I think it's very clear that Britain's regulatory system will be viewed as equivalent to the EU's, so that banks can get passports very quickly. And then, of course, there's also the question of the EU's capacity for finance.
Right.
There isn't much of a financial industry. Yeah, there are banks, yes, but the other financial services, they don't really exist outside of the UK and Switzerland in Europe. So the EU will probably remain reliant on British financial services for a very long time to come.
Well, Iain, it's interesting to get an update from you. We'll see how this Brexit rolls out. We'll be back with you in a year to check in again. Thanks for coming on the show.
Always a pleasure.
That was Iain Murray, Vice President for Strategy at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Now we'd like to welcome Richard Williams, Director for the Regulatory Studies Program at the Mercatus Center and former Director for Social Sciences at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Richard, welcome to the show.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
Richard, I asked you on because your expertise is in the consequence of overregulation, which not only impacts U.S. economic growth, but is one of the reasons given by our British cousins for their decision to seek a divorce with the EU. I'd like to start at home, and even more narrowly with the Food and Drug Administration, where you formerly served as the Associate Director for Social Services. What were your responsibilities there?
Well, I was there for 27 years, and I was the Social Science Director for the Food Safety and Applied Nutrition part of FDA. And my responsibilities were for economics, and that's regulatory impact analysis, consumer studies, which is the survey of consumers' knowledge and attitudes, and epidemiology.
I mean, the FDA is 110 years old now. How would you describe the culture?
I would describe it as a very closed culture. Most of the people at the FDA don't believe in markets, and they don't like markets. They think that sellers always take advantage of buyers, and they think that every single thing should be regulated. When Congress told FDA we could do something about safety of dietary supplements, we looked into it for a year trying to find a problem and literally just couldn't find anything. So I went to the head of that program and I said, you know what? Congress didn't say we had to do a regulation. There doesn't seem to be a problem here. Maybe we shouldn't do anything. And her response to me was, but Richard, we have to get these guys somewhere. And I think that is exactly the kind of sentiment that you get from FDA on every product that's under their purview.
Wow.
We have to get these guys somewhere.
One of the things that's not obvious to everyone is that the FDA can literally kill thousands of people without any consequences by holding a useful drug off the market. And yet if there's the smallest allegation that a new drug might be associated with bad side effects, all hell breaks loose and a plague of class action lawyers gets released. What is it about the asymmetry of publicity and the nature of modern journalism and tort law that creates this situation?
Well, it's not just tort law and journalism, it's also Congress. With any individual drug, when they're approved, they go through what they call randomized clinical control trials. But no matter what, there's only a certain number of people. Maybe it's even several thousand people in those trials. There's no way that a trial could uncover a drug that would be safe and efficacious for 320 million Americans. We're just too different for that to happen. So you're always going to get some kind of a problem with a drug. Somebody is going to be harmed, or it's not going to work for somebody. So having said that, what happens? When something does go wrong, the press picks up on it, and they blame FDA, and I believe incorrectly blame FDA. Congress will hold a hearing and ask, why have you done this? We're holding FDA responsible for something that literally they just don't have that kind of control.
One of the areas you've worked on is nutrition and food labeling. Environmental scaremongers have mounted a high-visibility campaign against GMOs or genetically modified food crops. I've seen polls that indicate that a majority of Americans are in favor of mandatory labeling for any food that contains DNA. What do you make of such powerful ignorance?
I think that we are, as a country, scientifically illiterate. Do you mind if I give you a list of some things that people are illiterate about when it comes to food?
Sure.
First of all, most people in this country do not need to avoid eating too much salt. Added sugars are not any different than natural sugars that you find in fruits, for example. They're all caloric. Putting added sugars on the label is just responding to that ignorance. How about carcinogens? A lot of people are very upset when they hear they might be eating something that causes cancer. If you believe in the animal test, which is basically giving these things to rodents, here's a couple of facts that you should know. You get more carcinogens in a cup of coffee, 1 cup of coffee, than in all of the pesticide residues that you ingest in a year. Does that mean coffee will give you cancer? Absolutely not. It just means pesticide residues are extremely safe because you ingest so few of them. Fruits and vegetables are loaded with carcinogens. So again, if you believe the rodent studies, you probably ought to just not go to the supermarket and eat anything. And then there's the idea of people who want to eat organic foods. How many people know, for example, that organic foods are 4 to 8 times more likely to be recalled for food poisoning? This is a kind of ignorance, and it's been transferred over to GMOs, which are some of the safest foods that you're going to eat on this planet. They're just the result of getting better at crossbreeding, which has now been done for 8,000 to 10,000 years.
The manipulation of public fears of GMOs have some pretty dire consequences when it comes to African agricultural economies, particularly in relation to their exports to the EU. Fill us in on that.
The potential for genetically modified organisms is huge in terms of solving a lot of problems, including for Africans. Look, the important thing is they do enhance yields. You use less water. Golden rice has been responsible for reducing blindness in Africa, among other places, and that's a genetically modified food. And yet, we have the activists going out and being against it, and it's not clear why. Let me give you another example where activists have caused a lot of illnesses and deaths. One of the great promises in the 1980s and 1990s was irradiation. The food activists got out and immediately invoked Hiroshima. They said, oh, you're going to be eating radiation. Nothing could be further than the truth. It's extremely safe. Here's the amount of radiation that's left in the food after you irradiate it. If you're sitting down outside and you stand up, you're that much closer to the sun. That's how much radiation would be remaining in a food that was irradiated. Yet it kills pathogens and probably would have prevented hundreds of thousands of cases of foodborne disease. But the activists killed it.
We're speaking with Richard Williams, Director for the Regulatory Studies Program at the Mercatus Center and former Director for Social Sciences at the FDA, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is a partnership with Real Clear Politics, which the New York Times has called an invaluable tool for anyone interested in politics or public affairs. You can check out Real Clear Radio Hour on iTunes or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. Ahead, we'll get Richard's view on the aftermath of Brexit and its relation to regulatory sclerosis. Stay tuned.
The Competitive Enterprise Institute is a nonprofit public interest group based in Washington, D.C., promoting innovation and entrepreneurship for a prosperous and peaceful society. Visit CEI.org to learn more.
Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We're speaking with Richard Williams, Director for the Regulatory Studies Program at the Mercatus Center and former Director for Social Sciences at the FDA. Richard, let's move on to the aftermath of Brexit. Now that the initial shock has worn off, people are taking a serious look at the long-term consequences of the UK leaving the EU. I've heard many critics of Brexit who point out that the British yes minister bureaucracy is just as bad and unaccountable as the one in Brussels, so why should they expect anything to change? Do they have a point?
I think they do have a point. And there's a great book, and I put it in one of the op-eds that I wrote, called How to Label a Goat. And it's about both EU and British regulations, and they're equally bad. So I think if the British people are going to do this, first of all, they may have to still follow some EU regulations, particularly if they want to export to EU countries. But I think they need to look at their own system and say, how can we improve it? How can we be better than the EU? And make sure that those people that want to exercise bureaucratic control over every part of your life don't get control. Let me give you an example of a quote I heard. I was in England, and it was a number of British regulators and EU regulators from all over the EU. A very high-ranking official from the EU stood up, and he gave the keynote talk, and he said, there are a number of areas of life that we do not have regulations for. He goes, this is something that we've got to immediately start working on. And there was wild applause by the entire crowd.
Is it true that chicken farmers in the UK have to label every egg with the identity of the chicken, or did some wag just make that up?
It was in that same book, How to Label a Goat, and what it said was that, yes, you have to label when the egg was laid and what was the name of the chicken. And frankly, I didn't even know all the chickens had names, but maybe, you've got to put February and Ethel. It cost £5,000 for these machines.
What would it take to repeal those kinds of vexatious regulations? I mean, there's a lot of politics involved. How would you sweep up and make a clean slate of the whole thing?
There are ways to do it. In fact, we've written a paper about this as part of retrospective review, and I think the way to do it is you don't go try to look at every single individual regulation. We have 175,000 pages of regulations in this country. You simply couldn't do it regulation by regulation. I think you have to look overall at the program and say, is this program necessary anymore? Let me give you an example of one in our country that may not be necessary anymore. I don't know. We've had tremendous success with the Clean Air Act. Every single one of the NACs, so-called NACs, now has been reduced to very low levels. So the question today is not, was EPA successful in getting these airborne pollutants reduced? They were. The question is now, should we go any farther when they're so low? We may be at the point where they're at the threshold, where they're not causing any harm to anybody. So maybe we want to keep continuing to enforce the rules that we have, but it may be time for the Clean Air Act to be revised to say we don't need to go any lower. That's a program that maybe can end. But we don't have anything like that in this country. One of the things that I think would be useful comes from a fellow that works with me who used to be a labor minister in New Zealand. And when they had a program that would come up for renewal and they were asking to be refunded, he had several questions that I thought were useful that we don't actually ask in this country. Let me give you some of those questions. What is the outcome goal? What is it that you're actually trying to achieve that will help consumers? What actions will you take in order to achieve this outcome? How much is it going to cost us? And here are the key questions. How will we know when you're done, and when will you be done? And could someone else do it better? We don't ever ask anybody, when will you be done? We pass laws, we put in place regulations and regulatory agencies, and we never ask, when will you be finished? When will you solve the problem? I think that's a good thing to start to ask.
You mentioned New Zealand. In the late 1980s and early 90s, they made some radical deregulatory changes that completely revitalized their economy, making it into one of the freest and most prosperous in the world. Could that be a roadmap for the UK now that they're breaking away from the EU?
I certainly hope so. And if they're going to follow that roadmap, they should do what they started to do in the 1980s. But then, unfortunately, and this happens so frequently, then slowly but surely they started to regulate themselves again. I'm not sure there's a good roadmap for anybody. I think it's one we have to invent before we just strangle ourselves with too many regulations, in particular, regulations that don't work. If they're regulations that cost too much or that aren't solving a problem, we've got to get rid of them and never bring them back.
Contrary to public misconceptions, big business loves regulations, especially if they crush small business. Would Brexit have any impact on that dynamic?
It's interesting. Again, I think it depends upon what the British end up doing. But that's fairly universal. Generally, larger businesses are able to hire legal staff to find ways to interact with the regulatory bureaus in order to get the regulations that they like. Not always and not all of them, but usually the people that suffer are going to be the small businesses that simply don't have the time or the resources to engage in the regulatory process. Particularly, there's a whole group of people that get hurt that never interact, and that's the people that someday would like to start a business, the potential entrants. They don't exist yet, and there's nobody there to protect them.
For those just joining us, we're speaking with Richard Williams, Director for the Regulatory Studies Program at the Mercatus Center and former Director for Social Sciences at the FDA. Much of Brexit was fueled by seething anger in parts of the population that really weren't connected to the ruling elite. We're seeing a lot of that here in the U.S. Do these folks understand the connection between the economic rigor mortis that seems to be setting in across the Western world and the overregulation that's caused a lot of it?
I think that is going to be the interesting question for our time, and hopefully we will find out in the next few years whether or not we actually have that kind of reaction. Most people in this country feel that we are overregulated. That's over half of the people in the United States feel we're overregulated. You then ask them about specific areas, and they go, well, we need regulations in that area. They understand that there's a problem. They don't understand the depth of the problem, and most people don't. It's very complex. It's very hard for Congress to oversee. All the presidents, going back all the way at least to Jimmy Carter, if not to President Hoover, have said it's extremely difficult to oversee the executive branch. So I think hopefully this is the sort of thing that people will wake up and go, it's time to do something. Look, the last major law that was passed affecting how we produce regulations was passed 70 years ago. In 1946, that was the Administrative Procedures Act. Congress hasn't done anything since then. It's time Congress woke up, did something about it, and hopefully people will get behind Congress and say, yes, it's time to pass something. It's time to solve some of these problems.
Well, that takes leadership, which begs the question, will we ever see another Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan? Or are the electorates in both the UK and the US too addicted to entitlements to try to turn the clock back?
Well, that's an interesting question, too. I don't think the entitlements are going to be turned back necessarily, not the way we would hope they would do. I think what's going to happen is they will either collapse or they will nearly collapse, and certainly Social Security is heading that way. The ACA almost certainly is collapsing now, and I think it's going to take a collapse before Congress is able to act. I don't think they're going to be able to act until we literally are in a very desperate situation.
If centrifugal forces pry the EU apart and there's a major international realignment, could a free trade pact amongst the English-speaking nations, the U.S., UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, come along as a counterbalance to the old EU?
Certainly. Trade is good for everyone. Trade is always good. This is sort of economics 101. It's amazing how many people don't get that. It's good for both sides of the trade. And so I'm sure there would be an emphasis on ensuring that trade within the EU happens, and not only within the EU, but the EU and us and everyone for that matter.
So, Richard, food safety seems to come on everyone's mind every time we have another Chipotle disaster or some kind of a high-visibility poisoning that takes place somewhere in the fast food business. How has the U.S. done over time in that area, and how safe is our food supply?
Well, first of all, our food supply is very safe. And the real question is, what does FDA have to do with it now, particularly? And the answer is not very much. They cause us to incur a lot of costs. But I was at the FDA for 27 years, and the numbers of cases of foodborne disease literally didn't change in 27 years, despite the fact we passed lots of regulation. The problem is, there's several problems. First of all, the approach that we take with food safety is we try to anticipate every problem, pass a regulation that prevents that problem from happening, and then we go out and inspect all the firms to comply. That technology, that regulatory technology, is old. That's the technology that we started in 1870. And it's old and it doesn't work anymore. For a lot of manufacturers, FDA is irrelevant. So what can we do instead? How can we actually improve it? In fact, there is a role for FDA. What we could do is when we do have an outbreak, we now have the technology where we can go back, trace that outbreak back to who caused it, and then we can investigate the outbreak, find out what caused it. All you have to do is put that on the internet. What caused this particular outbreak? What you will find is that insurance companies and downstream buyers will pick that up. They'll put it in their private food safety contracts, and this is already happening, hundreds of thousands of these contracts around the country, and manufacturers will fix it themselves. You don't really need to regulate. You can't inspect anyway. If you look at who sells food in this country, there's over 1 million outlets. There's no way that FDA is going to be able to inspect them with any frequency that makes sense. The way I like to put it is you go into your child's room and you say, boy, you need to get this room cleaned up right now, and I'll be back in 6 years to inspect you. How much of an incentive is that? That's pretty much what FDA tells people.
Well, it'd be very interesting if big data and communications end up solving the problems that FDA spent all this time and money on. Richard, thanks so much for coming on the show and sharing your expertise, and we'll talk to you again in the future.
Okay, thank you.
That was Richard Williams, Director for the Regulatory Studies Program at the Mercatus Center and former Director for Social Sciences at the FDA, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. You can check out Real Clear Radio Hour on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. And while you're at it, take a look at RealClearFuture.com for updates on the next big wave of technologies. We'd like to thank our long-term sponsor, Old Boston Restorations, for their support. Old Boston is a Victorian property management company in Boston's South End. Visit them online at oldbostonrestorations.com. That wraps up our show for this week. Please join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.
The Competitive Enterprise Institute is a nonprofit public interest group based in Washington, D.C., promoting innovation and entrepreneurship for a prosperous and peaceful society. Visit CEI.org to learn more.